Hello, this is Eliseo Rodriguez, and we are going to look at a little bit of information I've been wanting to give out a little more clearly about Arianism and about my understanding about how Arianism is what the early church was. And I think it's very important for me to give this information out because no one else that I know of has been talking about it, and I think it needs to be brought out. So this is my attempt to give all the information that I have about Arianism and what's happened and why the early church fathers, all of them, should be looked at as Arians. Now, did they have the name Arian on them? Were they called Arians back then? No. They were just Christians. And really, we shouldn't even be called Arians. We should be just called Christians. Because this is the original faith, the original doctrine. And this is what was taught by the apostles. And because now the church has been hijacked by a different belief system, they're calling the true church and the true gospel, the true belief system, they're calling it heretical, and they're giving it a name other than what it should be. Although I do accept the word Arianism, I am going to now cease using it as far as calling it Arianism today, and just call this faith in this group, in this church group in my mind, the kingdom of God and Christ. This is what I believe this group of people are. This is the kingdom of God and Christ. And I say God and Christ because Christ is not God. So it's differentiating between the two. But this faith system is something that we need to look at. So I want to really, without further ado, let's get into this. Here is Christopher Steed in his book Divine Substance. If you don't know Christopher Steed, I would look him up. He's a scholar. He knows a lot about the Bible, obviously. He studied the word HOMOOUSIOS, divine substance, as far back as he could go, to understand the usage of the word. And I guess probably because he's a Trinitarian, he was trying to prove that the church always believed HOMOOUSIOS, that the church always believed that Jesus and the Father were consubstantial, that they were together, the same, in the same form, in the same body, in the same substance, in the very same substance, not two separate substances, but one separate substance. And I think that's what he ventured to do. I think his attempt was to find out the origins of the word and see when it was used in the church. And I'm sure he was probably hoping that he could find it at the very beginning of the church and to prove that, look, here's the end of the argument. I've studied the word as far as it goes back, and Trinitarianism was always believed. I think that was his attempt, but in reality what he found out was that it wasn't in the church at the very beginning. And so in his book, Divine Substance, the 2nd century, in page 109 to 191, it says, the word homoousios, which is the word the Trinitarians use and that was fought about in the Council of Nicaea, usually translated consubstantial or coessential, appears to have been introduced by Gnostic Christians of the 2nd century. It occurs in summaries and criticisms of Gnostic teachings made by Irenaeus. It was used by Ptolemaeus, and is attributed to some other 2nd century Gnostics. And it also occurs once in the Poimandres. Otherwise, it is not found in pagan writers before Plotinus. So, who brought the word homoousios into the church? It was Gnostic Christians. The Gnostic Christians were insane with what they believed. They believed all kinds of things. And what he found was, going back 1,000 years, he did not find the church using it until they found the Gnostic Christians introducing it into the church. Not Jesus, not the apostles, not, divine revelation. It was Gnostic Christians who were obviously not the church. It says, when it first appears, it is not used to express the Christian theology of the Trinity. Amazing. the first time it's used is not for the doctrine of the Trinity. So they had the concept, but it wasn't about the doctrine of the Trinity. So can we say from this what we've already read so far, can we say that the doctrine of the Trinity existed at the beginning of the church with the apostles and with all of them? No. We cannot. It's not there. It was not there. There was no Trinity in existence at the beginning of the church. Whoever tells you that that's true, it's a lie. It's a fallacy. So after we establish this truth and I prove to you that there's a difference, then you need to say, well, what other faith was there in the church besides this Trinity thing? And the only other thing that existed in the church besides the doctrine of the Trinity is what is called Arianism today. That is what the faith was. The original church faith was what is today called Arianism, what was back then called just truth. And I can prove that by saying that the church, Arianism, was in the church before Nicaea and after Nicaea for 60 years. So because of that truth right there, we have to admit that Arianism was in fact part of the church at one point, and the only other thing that existed was, I guess, really, after 325 or whatever, there existed this Gnostic teaching in the church about Trinitarianism. I don't believe that Trinitarianism existed before the Council of Nicaea. I don't believe so. I think the whole church was Arian up until that point. But to prove the point, the doctrine of the Trinity and the use of the word the HOMOOUSIOS, it doesn't exist. There's no use of the word, even though they spoke Greek back then, and all the New Testament, most of the New Testament is written in Greek. They didn't use the word back then. There's no Trinity back then. So then we move to this. The case is rather that the Gnostics and their opponents introduced the term in common places of debate which go back to pre-Christian times. So the Gnostics, when they debated, they used the word. So where does the word come from? Does it come from the apostles? Does it come from Jesus? Does it come from the early church fathers? No, it does not. 2nd century. Jesus died at mid-1st century, right? 330 AD. That's the 1st century up to 100. The 2nd century is from 100 on to 200. And at some time, even before Jesus even came, they used the word consubstantial or homoousios in their own debates, and now they're bringing that from their Gnostic world into this Christian Gnosticism that they're developing. So it doesn't come from the church, doesn't come from the apostles, doesn't come from Jesus. So that's a fallacy. This is proving that there was no such thing as a doctrine of Trinity back then. So the surviving instances of the Greek word itself for the whole, down to the breakdown of the Arian controversy, are not very numerous. He's saying, so going from, the dawn of time up until Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, the word is used not very many times. So it says, thus the scantily 2nd century evidence, one passage in Ptolemaeus and 5 in Irenaeus, adverse heresies, are the only certain examples that can be supplemented by adding a number of pages in Irenaeus where the Greek is lacking, but in the Latin has unus substantiae. This phrase seems to be a regular equivalent since it is used in all 5 cases to render homoousios and is never used where the Greek survives to render any other term or phrase. This yields a series of 19 2nd century examples which may be listed in order from Ptolemaeus. So 2 through the first one is from Ptolemaeus. The 2nd and the 3rd instances of the word homoousios are from Irenaeus, book 1, and the 7th through the 19th are from Irenaeus' books that are written in Latin. So that's it. That's the only time you see it from pre-Christian times to the Council of Nicaea 19 times, and some of them are from the same books that are translated in Greek, that they're translated in, that are made in Greek and translated into Latin. Those books are the very same, but they're saying sometimes it might be meant to be there and sometimes not. So it's not even officially 19, but it's a 19 if you're going to go that route and be that detailed and insist that some words mean what they're not in a different language. So we'll go with the 19 though. 19 times is it in the world record found. Okay? In all of history, with all the documents that we have today, 19 times, whether Christian or non-Christian, that's where it's at. Irenaeus is an early church father. He used the word to describe Gnostics. He didn't use it for the church. He didn't use it in his doctrine. He used it to explain their doctrine. He never used it for Jesus and the Father. So what are you getting? What are you understanding from this? You're understanding that there is no such thing as HOMOOUSIOS, that idea, ever being used in the church prior to the Council of Nicaea in our doctrine. Prior to the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, 225 years or 200 years later, after Jesus died, is the first times that we're starting to see the words being used for Jesus and the Father. So what are you getting? What are you understanding? You guys who are believing the doctrine of the Trinity, what are you seeing? You're seeing that your argument that the doctrine of the Trinity has always been, since the beginning of the church, a lie. If the doctrine of the Trinity does not exist in HOMOOUSIOS and the idea of HOMOOUSIOS, the idea doesn't exist. They're not using the word, although Irenaeus knows of the existence of the word, and the word has existed at least even in pre-Christian times. So it's not like a word that's unusual and not known and not discovered and no one knew about it. It's a pre-Christian word that's been brought into the Christian world through the Gnostics. So I'm showing you right here that if there's no idea of consubstantial, if there's no idea of coessential, if there's no idea of sharing the same substance in Christian doctrine, and that's a reality, if that does not exist, what are you left with? What are you left with? If you don't have this idea that they're one and the same, what are you left with? You're left with what is now called Arianism. That's what you're left with. You're left with the ideas that there is a God who is the Father, and He had a Son before the earth and before the creation of the heavens and the earth, and that He created through His Son. That His Son was in the form of God, and that at some point during the time of Mary's existence, He changed, and I'm going to use the word transformed, from one form, from the form of God, like Philippians chapter 2 verse 6 says, to becoming a man. The Word became flesh. God is spirit, and when Jesus was born, He was spirit as well. He was the same form as His Father. So when you say, when God has a Son, when a God has a Son who's made exactly after Him, what kind is this Son? You have to say He's a God. But He's not the God. Which is why Jesus says in John chapter 17 verse 3 that He's talking about the Father, the only true God. He's not calling Himself the only true God. He's talking about His Father. So when you don't have the consubstantial idea in existence in the church prior to the Council of Nicaea, then all you're left with is what is called Arianism today. Although back then it wasn't called Arianism because Arius wasn't even alive back then. I'm talking about early church fathers. So if you understand now that there is no such word that is ever used in pre-Nicene, Council of Nicaea times, what is the church then? The church is what is called Arianism. And the reason why there was a fight between Trinitarianism and Arianism is because one of those two was the truth. And one of them was being introduced into the church. Now, given in light of this man's studying of thousands and thousands and thousands of years of every single document known to man, pre-Christian to Nicaea, this is all he found was 19 times. And I'm pretty sure he was pretty exhaustive to look at every single thing that's been known to man to find. And that's what he says. So it was never a part of the church to begin with. So the church to begin with, without this consubstantial doctrine, all you're left with is Arianism. What is called Arianism today? It wasn't called Arianism back then. And we'll look into this a little further when we go down. You'll see that because Arius didn't exist and nobody used the word Arianism, everything that was prior to the Council of Nicaea they call something else other than Arianism. Although it's still exactly the same as Arianism, they want to call it something else. Binitarianism. They want to call it subordinationism. They want to call it monarchianism. They want to call it all kinds of stuff. But in reality, when you don't have the use of homoousios in the church, all you're left with is separate beings. And if they're separate beings, that's what Arianism sees them as. So, you guys have a great week. Hopefully I will move on to the next part of this and we'll just go through this whole paper. It's 209 pages. We won't do all 209. Some of them are just, page numbers or chapter titles and stuff like that. But I hope you get the idea.